anyhow, so just my usual title slide, move along quickly here. Okay, if I can get this to advance properly. Why is this not going forwards? Well, I could do that at least. So just to recap, from the last time I gave a similar talk or previous talk about a year ago or so. So don't want to repeat everything there other than, I am a Boise native, as Carrie said, returned to Boise in 2005 after spending my career as a professional botanist. I've been working on the Boise flora casually since I was a undergrad in the 1970s. It became my primary project during the pandemic. And I decided to use an online format to make the results available. So here's what the front page of the online page is, boisefrontnature.com. I'm not going to talk a lot about this at the moment because I talked about it earlier or previously, but just some of the new things and conclusions. Conclusion one, the Boise Front is special. I mean, it's got the diverse geology, including the Idaho batholith, Lake Idaho sediments, basalt flows, other stuff. It's actually right at the overlap of 3 floristic provinces, the Rocky Mountain, Pacific Northwest Intermountain region. There's a 5,000-foot elevational gradient from the shrub steppe and river bottomland to conifer forest. With the result, it's a rich diversity of plants, many previously unrecorded, including several unique and otherwise noteworthy species. Conclusion number 2, it's amazing, surprisingly underbotanized. And I think this is because people tend to take our local flora for granted and assuming it's already well known. Lots of springtime collections, especially from Boise State students. But then we tend to like to scatter to more interesting areas, or what we can, once the snow melts in the high country, or, school's over. Limited. Okay. Somebody's not muted. Okay. Limited public access in many areas. And as one result, the existing wildflower guides and lists are only a subset of what is actually present. And even the current project is a long-term work in progress. So just some of the progress made in the last year. More exploration and discoveries. I'd hoped to hit more at the mid elevations and Lucky Peak, but then it got hot way too quickly. But then it turned out to be nice for exploring by water instead. It pulled out my inflatable kayak. Lots of new photos. Finally made it back into the herbaria, which I couldn't do during the height of COVID, and evaluate possible additions. Majority of which, as I suspect, turned out to be misidentifications, but until you check, you can't know. Believe it or not, added about 100 species in the last year to what I had before, and doing a lot of ongoing nomenclatural and other updates. Revised geographic coverage, reconsidering some things. This is with a map that Martha Braybeck very nicely keeps updating for me. The goal is a reminder of the boundaries of the region we're talking about. There's Boise, so trying to get the maximum habitat diversity on publicly accessible trails within maybe about an hour's drive of downtown Boise, and using kind of the more CUNA Road is the southern boundary, which is somewhat artificial, but it's already pushing the limit of what counts as Boise Front. But it gives us a whole bunch of other things to look at, and some cool places, as you'll see. I've now got enough information. I've started entering distributions for at least the less abundant species. That's going to be a long-term to get everything in there, but at least it's enough to search on and get a sense. Thanks to Ann Halford, there were some BLM funds to hire Christina Riddle. She transcribed Bernice Bjornson's A Key to the Spring Flora of Southwestern Idaho, but which has some real cool excerpts that I'll want to include. We added flower color to the searchable categories, and she entered that. She also went through the species wildflower walks and other sources for the species list. Paul Schaefer, our IMPS webmaster, is the reason why the website can exist. He's modified the page layout, uploaded the additional photos as I get them ready, which is a long-term process. Mostly I haven't added them yet. Expanded the search page capabilities and does all sorts of other things beyond that I can keep track of. So this is what the search page currently looks like if you can find your way there from the species list. So you can combine a search. So if you wanted to say get all Asteraceae that were herbaceous with red flowers, if there are any, or yellow flowers in the Lecotique area that are native, you can actually use the website for doing combinations of all these queries. And it's really been useful for me to be doing. I mean, I couldn't have done this presentation if I hadn't been able to do these kinds of queries. A lot of it's still not complete. Like I said, the distribution is only, maybe 60%, I don't know. But we're working on it. I mean, so it's now enough to get a lot of the stuff. And we also, I'll eventually add the bloom time. But I wanted the local bloom time rather than something that I could just pull off the thing. So drum roll, here's where, if you haven't got your number in yet, 449 is the herbaceous natives according to the current tally. Though this is a moving target, I keep finding more stuff, but for this purposes, whoever got closest to 449 is going to be the winner today. But notice that, okay, we've got native, non-native, some that are both are uncertain, and I'm not going to go a lot into that. But total number of plants that I'm currently keeping track of is over 1,000, up to 1,042. 643 are native, 385 non-natives. Let's see, looking at it a different way. You can see that the native forbs are the largest component of what's here, next followed by non-natives. And the thing that I really want to emphasize in this talk is really focusing on these native forbs because they really tend to get appreciated. They're appreciated as wildflowers, but in terms of something that actually factors into keeping track of, they're just taken for granted too much. I mean, so much of the conservation, restoration, there's a handful of things that are considered rare that we track. We keep track of the native woodies and graminoids and use these for restoration. We're starting to get a few of the native forbs in restoration, but nowhere proportional to what's actually out there. And I'm really wanting to kind of share with you more of just how much amazing, for those of you who don't know, forb is the term for a herbaceous plant that isn't a grass, pretty much, or a fern. It's just a shorthand. Okay, and then these are broken into subcategories. So within native, there's also some that are called sensitive and historical. And just to go through that a little bit more, historical is where I've got a previous record of it, a herbarium specimen primarily, but I haven't been able to locate extant populations. It might be that I just haven't got to the places they grow, but it makes an interesting thing to look for. Sensitive doesn't include just the federal and state sensitive, but I'm really paying attention to the things that are very uncommon within the flora boundary, the regionally uncommon stuff. Right now, this is currently subjective. I had to come up with, just kind of something quickly for this talk. But I'd like to work more towards, something like, maybe anything that is known from less than 10 populations in the foothills. But this could be something for discussion. Much more work needed, but just notice that the total number of these natives, and this isn't just forbs, that are historical or sensitive is 1/4 of the native flora qualifies. Best known sensitive plants are things like the Aussie's onion, Mulford's milkvetch, Sacagawea bitterroot, the peppergrass, slickspot peppergrass, a couple of newly published sensitive plants, recently published, the Boise sand verbena, Andrus's biscuit root. And then there's subcategories of the non-natives as well. There's ones that are invasive, and this is both ones that actually have federal or state status of noxious invasive, but there's others that I believe have a strong potential for displacing native diversity. And again, this is somewhat subjective, but it's based on experience of things that look very, giving all the signs of, what's to worry about. Persisting isn't, not a lot of those, but I'm thinking of the lilac that's along the Watchman Trail here in Old Homestead. It's not really spreading, but it's persisting. It's well away from any place you'd expect it now. Waifs are things that are documented at least once, but have either disappeared after that one appearance, or it's uncertain if they're going to hang around. So that's just kind of the intermediate category of, well, are they here or not? I'm trying to be inclusive of everything I can find outside of intended cultivation. Just to show how much, there's a steady rain of new non-natives showing up constantly. You'd be surprised. This is just a sampling of the ones that I have found locally that are probably new records as far as I can tell for Southern Idaho. And not going to talk about these other than just show, yeah, there's a steady rain of things showing up. Some of them do have invasive potential. And these are some of the things that, definitely need. I mean, hardy pampas grass, we've had a lot of discussion on within the board that it's a cultivated thing that is escaping and is really looking like it could be a problem. Patience dock, I keep trying to get to people's attention as being more concerned than we realize. It looks like curly dock on steroids, but it can really dominate the landscape. Along the green belt, we've been fighting to try to get, oh, sorry, I can't read what my bottom here is because of what's on my screen. Okay, no, that didn't work, sorry. Anyhow, several other, including the euonymus, is now showing up a lot in the green belt and the foothills. Then there's the planted category, which is one that I came up with for things that are regionally native, and they're often considered native. But I have reason to believe that they wouldn't have been here in the Boise foothills except for being intentionally planted. So there's some surprising cliff rose in a couple of places. Four-winged shad scale, I don't think is native in the foothills. Certainly native in this part of Idaho, but just not, within the bounds. And part of how I make these decisions is, are there old herbarium records of it? Did I see it growing up here? And this is one where the four-winged shad scale that's in Cottonwood Creek area wasn't there when I was growing up, but after there was a fire and post-fire seeding, that's when it showed up. And I'm guessing that none of it in the foothills is native. I only see silver sagebrush planted. And of course, the Palmer's penstemon is planted. There's a few more that are a little, these are kind of the puzzle for you. Are these native or not? Any guesses? Turns out none of these, as far as I can tell, are native in the Boise Front. Although this juniper sometimes gets confused with the native scopularum. I think all of it is just junipers escape from cultivation, and I might be Chinensis, but if it escaped from cultivation, it opens up a wide door of possibilities. And I'm not good at juniper identification. Firecracker penstemon in Hulls Gulch, lovely, not native. And I'll talk more about, turns out that the common flax is actually the European species rather than the native. And although we do have native box elder in southeastern Idaho, the native one has hairy stems. This one has glabrous stems, which means it's the eastern species. So it would have been brought by the pioneers and planted here. So again, it could be native, but the one we have here isn't. Another reason to pay attention to the actual varieties. Okay, the core of my talk, I'm going to go through the different geographic subunits and give you a little bit of the highlights, starting from the south and working my way up to the conifer zone. So South Boise, bounded by Interstate 84, the Kimmerer Road, and then I've been using Eagle Road as my western boundary. And the South Boise area is increasingly degraded to converted sagebrush steppe, but it also has a rich floristic diversity of seasonal wetlands too. and pointing out that both South Boise and the Oregon Territory are in a different flora. Most of the Boise Front falls within the bounds of the flora of the Pacific Northwest. And so this is the book you would use to key things out. And it works pretty much for the area just to the south of us too, but you do start running into a few other things that you would have to use flora of the Pacific, the Intermountain flora to identify. So part of the increased floristic diversity, one of the things that also means there isn't an existing flora that covers everything. Some of the special habitats, because that's where you find special plants. There's these lovely rimrock lined streams, some seasonal mudflats, some of the sensitive plants, 14 total by my current, grabbing a number or, coming up with something. There's the water thread pondweed, Minidoka penstemon, cute little mudwort there, and rigid sagebrush in one spot. Here's some of the things that are known only from historical records in South Boise. And maybe they're there, but nobody's been out looking for them, because even with my searching, there's an awful lot of ground to cover. I would argue there's an urgent need for more preserved natural open space in South Boise. The main places I'm familiar with is Hubbard Reservoir, Blacks Creek Reservoir, both with an uncertain future of what they're going to happen next. And this is in an area with rapid development that is rapidly reducing open space while simultaneously increasing the recreational demand. So, I really would like to see more preserved and not just pretty lawns and trees, but actually the open space as well. There's some of the neat places. There's spectacular wetland wildflowers at Hubbard Reservoir. There's also a little remnant shrub steppe that if one was going to try doing restoration, this is where I would strongly encourage some work. One of the odd things that's there is variation in the pricklyleaf phlox, that the ones at Hubbard Reservoir, just a tiny population, have much shorter, stiffer, greener or bluish green leaves as compared to what you find in the foothills, where they also, in the foothills, it integrates with longleaf fox. So there are people, researchers elsewhere, who are working on phlox, and who knows what they'd end up doing with these. Blacks Creek Bird Reserve, I consider a neglected jewel, but it's still heavily grazed, no cows in these pictures, but it does have some marvelous scenes. The display of the tansy-leafed evening primrose can be phenomenal. Okay, anyhow, so then moving on to the Oregon Trail subunit here, east of Interstate 84, kind of going to the rimrock there above the Boise River, and let's see, Bonneville Point there. We're on basalt flows overlain by sediments, and like South Boise, this is also within the Intermountain flora, so you're going to find different plants that you're going to find north of the Boise River. Some of the special habitats, there's some Mima mound, mound intermound, where you've got the higher mounds and then the more scablandy stuff in between. There's some vernal wetlands, some nice columnar basalt. And this is always the tricky, when you've got this open bare ground that looks like it's just wasteland, but that's sometimes your most precious habitat. In this case, we got a rare plant here. So having these open, unusual geological soil types. So some of the sensitive plants in the Oregon Trail segment are the hare's foot milkvetch, a very pale form of the bighead clover, very common in the Owyhees, but this is the only place I know of it locally. Some big fruit biscuit root, and I love the little wiregrass. Regiopappus is always fun to find. It's in this area that you can also find a little bit of the Scutellaria nana, which is particularly fun because in Lytle Gulch is probably the type locality of what had been originally described as Scutellaria footiana, named after Mary Halleck Foote by Isabel Mulford, which those of you who know her, it's kind of nice having this one botanical connection and knowing it's still growing in Lytle Gulch, if you know where to look at the right time. Also in Oregon Trail on the rim rock, there's one place where there's an odd mugwort that seems different from the one that's the more common one. It needs more work, could be something different. Realize there's a lot of undescribed stuff still to be known. Okay, and here's a list of a few of the species known only from historical records from the Oregon Trail area. But there wasn't really many historical records to start from. So this is probably an underrepresentation of possible lost biodiversity. Okay. And there's plenty of threats to the flower diversity in the Oregon Trail. There's the ongoing invasion and degradation of the habitats, especially by irresponsible recreational users. There's development that's starting to encroach on the canyon rim and would disrupt the continuity of trails. And it's just generally not being the area that's got a lot of attention that it really deserves. It's prime open space that should be treated as such for the Boise area. So I'm pleased that there is now an Oregon Trail Recreation Area Master Plan that I found online. Haven't read the details, don't know what's happening, but it's good that there's some plan going on. The Greenbelt is not just the gallery forest along the river that is a mixture of native and non-native trees, but also includes all the other flatlands and residential areas north of Interstate 84. And actually we'll even include the residential areas that extend up into the foothills. Some of the native species that are only known from historical records, probably again a significant underrepresentation because we don't have records of what was there before the Boise, the Boise Flatlands were the first place that was converted first to agriculture and then development. I mean, it's interesting reading Tucker's, let's see, when Boone, the president, founder of College of Idaho, first came to Caldwell. I mean, in those days, he pointed out you could hike to Indian Creek and find camas, hyacinth, rooster bills, bluebells, violets, Indian paintbrush larks, for buttercups. I have no idea what rooster bills are, and dozens of others, which we now search for in the more distant mountain foothills. And these were probably through the Boise Flatlands too. Some of the special habitats that still exist, there's still a little bit of alkali flat playa at Chief Eagle Eye Reserve. I think the seasonally flooded wetlands along the Boise River, need to be valued in their own right as they are, rather than what they could be turned into. Some of the sensitive plants of the Greenbelt is the sickle saltbush in those alkali flats. Shrubby willow herb is still present in one location along the river. Find a little bit of the gradiola along the river, and one place where you can still find this guy. One of the more intriguing one is the hairy panic grass, Dicanthelium acuminatum. There's two subspecies recognized in Idaho, the widespread one, and then one that's supposed to just be around hot springs. And this one's actually a bit closer to the one that should just be around hot springs. But I'm not sure, maybe they just get washed down from hot springs in the Boise River and a few of them hang out, but it is definitely a sensitive one to pay attention to and kind of fun. Introduce the concept of, we got some surprising lookalike natives and non-natives. So, a lot of us are familiar with the large leaf avens, which is native, but it turns out that there's an invasive lookalike that has really been taking over the Julie Davis Park and a lot of other areas, showing up in people's gardens now, just spreading like crazy. And people might be thinking it's the large leaf one when it's actually the non-native. Here's another lookalike ones, American wintercress versus the bitter wintercress that's starting to spread along the river. There's some subtle differences in the leaves. The most obvious one that the most reliable, I can't tell from the picture so much, is on the non-native, the stigma tip is maybe 3 millimeters long, while on the native, it's only about 1 millimeter long. They grow in different habitats for the most part, but again, it makes management hard because this could actually qualify as a sensitive, and whether this one's going to take over or not remains to be seen. Here's a couple. Turns out that we have two dogwoods, the native red osier dogwood, but the one that's actually most common along the green belt near Boise State University is a European species. Which you can tell most definitively when it's in fruit, because the blood twig has blackberries as compared to the red osier, which is white or maybe a little bit bluish. The blood twig also tends to have fewer veins, as you can see, but it's tricky. I've talked previously a little bit about telling the native versus the non-native roses. The natives have very slender prickles, while the non-natives around here anyhow have very thick prickles, different growth form. Also, the non-natives, most of them will have these little appendages coming off some of the sepals, while the natives don't have that. The glandularity can varies. But we actually have at least 4 different non-native species in the Boise Front, the most common being the dog rose with pretty much glabrous leaves, sharp teeth, kind of pointed. Eglantine is the next most common one, which is densely glandular and somewhat more rounded leaves. It smells like green apples. You can tell it even, just by being around it. The dog rose, and then we've got the round leaf rose here, which is also somewhat rounded, but it doesn't have glands, but it's somewhat hairy. And then there's the invasive, in some places, multiflora rose, which has lots of little teeny white flowers and more leaves. So, and tends to have a different habit. Some of the lesser known invasives in the greenbelt and other. Hoary mustard has just totally taken over slopes at the west end of Harris Ranch along the greenbelt. Birch Herval is just exploding along the greenbelt to places in the foothills, horridweed, and we didn't jump on it quick enough, and I'm not sure anything can be done anymore. The Genista tinctoria again, this is one, we could probably get rid of if we jumped on it, but trying to get enough political will or whatever. And I'm getting concerned that the euonymus is starting to show up in surprising places and hasn't been on the radar screen, but it can be a problem. Okay, moving to the Foothills subunit. It's kind of the part of the sedimentary bathtub ring of Old Lake, Idaho. So from the edges of the flatlands going up to the top of the sediments, mostly it's the sand derived from the batholith, but there's the sand there. Some rhyolite and basalt areas, mostly more or less invaded shrub steppe. Just for those of you who aren't familiar, here's one recreation, give you an idea that we used to, back 2 to 9 million years ago, off and on, there'd be a lake actually filling the whole western Snake River Plains. And so we would have had erosion from the Idaho batholith, coming down on this part of the lake. And this is the only place where you've got this combination of batholith and lake, and that makes part of it unique. Unfortunately, upper stretches of it have pretty much lost much of their diversity. It's been managed as pasture land for over 100 years now, primarily with non-native grasses intentionally planted. Plus fires have swept through several times, and that lowers the diversity. So it's kind of sad, but yeah, that's the other extreme. Special habitats of the foothills include the open slopes of loose sand. This is the most important one. Unfortunately, these really are disappearing as they get filled up with cheatgrass and other stuff, because all the plants that require them need this open space. Once it's closed canopy, thatch covered with thatch, it no longer works. A few places where there's rhyolite outcrops, which harbor a few things of interest in their own right. So some of the open sand rarities, good old Alcie's onion, Milford's milkvetch, the abronia, Franklin's sandwort, hairy wild cabbage. It's these, that's the tall spiky thing sticking up in front of this bitterbrush. Lindley silver puffs, this weird little moon cup I found is a common name for it. It's a little evening primrose, and a couple of gilias, which again, all seem, I think that it really makes the point that this open sand is one of our most interesting rare habitats. You often can find some of these formerly Aurobanki fasciculatum. The most common one has recently, well, both of these are currently now known and just recently as Aphyllum franciscanum. All these name changes to keep track of, but we seem to have 2 slightly different ones. This one with a slightly more pale rounded petals that grows on Phacelia. I mean, they're parasitic plants, so it's a root parasite. But this one has more pointed, a little bit more lemon colored ones. And this I found in only 1 or 2 spots on Polecat Gulch, and it seemed to be growing on attached to buckwheat instead. And who they're parasitizing does seem to have significance. A few other sensitive foothill plants out of 30, just using the examples, slick spot peppergrass, Anders's biscuit root, the Cusick's primrose, the Sidalcia, Oregon checker spot is actually unusual. The pubescence type is slightly different here than elsewhere. And, you know, whether or not more study would say, well, maybe it also needs its own name. Hard to know. A few more sensitive plants, a few places you can still find Cusick's penstemon, pepperpod, which used to be common and is harder and harder to find. I love the name, of course, genus name, of course. A few places to find the small leaf bricklebush. And although we've got several, quite a few places to find Munro's Spheralcia, I only know of the gooseberry leafed species in one spot in the Boise Front, and that's in the East Foothills Reserve. So that's kind of neat. Some of the native species known only from historical records in the foothills. I wanted to mention the Apocynon dogbanes. We've got the hemp dogbane along the river, the spreading dogbane, mostly up towards the conifer zone. These are the only ones I'd known, and then kept trying to say, but which one do I shoehorn this? And finally I've realized, no, the most common one we have in the foothills and mid elevations is supposed to be the hybrid between the two, but is actually the most common thing that we have here. I think it's actually now become its own stabilized thing, which is interesting. I mean, all of this kind of greenish stuff, it's actually seems to be a native species that is pre-adapted, and, you know, maybe it's emerging because it's the thing that can thrive in these otherwise low diversity pasture lands. So evolution keeps going. Life finds a way, as they say. You also find shrubs persisting from research plantings by the Rocky Mountain Research Station in the 60s and 70s, cliff rose, Mojave ceanothus, one place with a little bit of Apache plume hanging on. And I even found an ephedra, this last year. Cactus, I mean, the prickly pear is curious. It grows in 2 different spots, Chief Eagle Eye Reserve, and there's a population on the Bogus Basin Road, and they're different colors. So that makes it unlikely they're remnants, but why would anybody have planted them there? Unless if it might have been important to the indigenous people. Good questions. One of the changes I've done is decided to carve out West Valley as its own unit for the basically Hidden Springs and Dry Creek and Spring Creek valleys, or if you go by communities, Hidden Springs and Avamore, east to about Daniels Creek. Similar to the foothills, but there is more geological diversity and habitats for different plants. Some sensitive historical species actually you'd expect to find more in the Oahes, and this is the only place that they show up this side of the Snake River Plains. Still sparsely explored, lots more to do. Beautiful country. Some of the special habitats, here's our so-called barren open space, which is actually a very special habitat type, rather than just bare ground that you can, I don't have to worry about hurting anything. No, it's the special stuff. And then the remnant wetlands. Some of the sensitive species, it's the only place to find purple sage, and there's pallid milkweed, another milk vetch, and camas as well. There's a form of Tolmie's onion that's also, well, I think it's Tolmie's onion. It really kind of doesn't want to fit anything. And there's another one that needs more work, also in the East Foothills Reserve. Several native species known only from historical records, a lot of historical collections from Spring Valley Ranch. So that gives us some idea. And some might still be there, but a lot more exploration. Okay, here's a couple of another lookalike native, non-native. The native Lewis's flax, which I've figured out grows and with the Boise Front, you're only going to find this up in the conifer zone on Schaefer Butte or thereabouts. The native Lewis's flax, the stigmas and the anthers are about the same length to each other and in all flowers. That's called homostylus. The alternate is heterostylus, and that's what all of the ones that are planted in the foothills, you know, that you think is native and is often included in seeding mixtures as native. But if you look, they come in two different forms. Some have the style much larger than the, or sticking out further than the anthers, and the other have the anthers sticking out further than the styles. And this encourages cross-pollination because, you know, a bee visits this and carries the pollen from this one to this one rather than to its own. And it's really cool once you home in on it, but it also shows that most of what we consider to be, you know, wild flax is actually non-native. Another lookalike ones, we've got the nettle cinquefoil, which is sensitive, has bright yellow flowers, and then the sulfur cinquefoil, which has pale yellow flowers. That's the easiest way to tell them apart. And this one's invasive, this one's sensitive, and they can be growing in the same drainages. Okay, above the foothills in West Valley, you hit mid elevations. This is above the Lake Idaho sediments, but below the conifer zone. Also shrub steppe. I'm finding limited access points for short hikes, so it's underbotanized where I'd hope to spend more time. Some of the special habitats, windswept ridge, which might actually qualify as the uppermost edge of the sediments, you know, the uppermost terrace, but it's got some the white phlox here. And then these granite outcrops with these exposed decomposed granite. That is also a unique habitat. Some of the sensitive species, the Boise milkvetch, Oregon catchfly, leopard lily, and finally found some shooting stars here as well. So it's fun. Lots of now getting more historical records, but some of these might just be, I haven't gone back to the right spot to look at them. So this would be a great thing for people who wanted to help with the project to go look for them. Point out that growing in these kind of habitats, there is a problematic allium. Light pink flowers. It's similar, you know, it's generally been put as either Aussie's onion or Allium simillimum. Right now, it's generally considered Allium simillimum, but it differs from that one too, though, you know, tends to be pinker and broader leaves. And I really think it should be considered as its own taxon, but that's, again, more work. Okay, shifting to Lucky Peak Reservoir subunit. Basically between Highway 21 north to Roby Creek and up to Arrow Rock Dam. Similar to the mid elevation, but got, of course, the aquatic stuff around the reservoir. A few official trails and trailheads, a lot more botanizing to do. Special habitats, again, more outcrops, including lots of the decomposing granite, and also the edges of the wetlands, if you can still find intact ones. Some of the sensitive species, Neeson's monkey flower is the common name I've seen for what used to be Mimulus cusicia, or at least part of it. Let's see, bitterroot is, true bitter is known from the top of Cervity Peak. Found some Stachys pilosa, and I like the little pygmy, water pygmy weed. Cute. There's even an isolated population of Pedicactus, probably Simpsonii, but with a typically deep pink flowers. Haven't heard back from the person that I sent the material to figure out. The variant of Silky lupin that's in Lucky Peak seems to be a bit different from what's on the conifer zone, different shade of pink, more likely to be single stemmed, tricky. Only a couple of historical records, but again, probably it had never really been documented much beforehand, and lots more floristic exploration needed, which would probably involve a boat to get to the other side of the reservoir. Another invasive to worry about is the spotted jewelweed. Found this dominating the understory at Roby Creek Park. It's been found further downstream in Caldwell area along the Boise River. So it'll probably eventually show up in the Boise portion of the Greenbelt as well, if we don't jump on it. Conifer zone subunit. It's the crest of the Boise Ridge, which is basically functioning as an elevational island at the edge of the Northern Rocky Mountains. Because it's down everywhere else. to get to any. It's open dud fir and ponderosa pine. As you know, there's a major forest thinning project underway. Sparsely botanized except at the major access points. So a lot more botanizing to do by people who either have good four-wheel drives or like to walk distances or however get to places that I haven't been to yet. Special habitats, beautiful natural rock gardens in the highest elevations. Lots of lovely springs, some, just actually this includes roadside drainage areas where the water gets trapped along the edge of the road, but it's wonderful wetland habitat. The dense shade of forests is a special habitat. There's plants that only grow in this, and unfortunately this is what may disappear by forest thinning, though you could easily leave islands of this kind of habitat and still accomplish your goal. Wetlands are in flat meadows, another special habitat. And surprisingly, if you really want some amazing wildflower displays, it's the artificially maintained areas below ski slopes that are some of the best displays. So don't knock it. For the sensitive species, Sacagawea bitterroot is the best known. I've been curious, there's one little spot for this odd Physaria, formerly Lescarella, with the fruit that are shorter than leaves as compared. Normally the fruit would be sticking out longer than the leaves, and it normally grows on calcareous substrates. What it's doing on granite in just one spot. I think it's a good candidate for an undescribed, and maybe there's more of it in the Boise Mountains, Soldier Mountains, a lot more of the unexplored habitat in that direction too. Trying to figure out which paintbrush is on Schaefer Butte. Let's see, hopefully we'll get, one of the people working on the genus to look at it more closely at some point, because they are recognizing a whole bunch more variety species within Castanea. But this is the color form that you find in the middle elevations. Here's some Rexifolia that I don't have a picture of my own, so I just stole the web. And you usually tell them apart by the color. But the one on Schaefer Butte, which I found herbarium specimens under both names, it's got the morphology of Miniata, but the color is closer to Rexifolia. So go figure. Some other sensitive species, and I've got 40 plus. I mean, there's an awful lot of stuff there that, unless if there's more that I haven't found in the other unexplored things to make them not as sensitive as I think. Cusick's bluebell, fleece flower, alpine or epilobium, eriogonum pyrolifolium, and the lookalike to it is the little Caloptridium umbulatum. Some sensitive species on wet sites, a couple of places with the brook saxifrage, the white bog orchid, red baneberry, and lady's fern is there. In shaded understory is where you can find a couple of orchids, the Western rattlesnake plantain and the Alaska rain orchid. You can find the pine drops and even a little bit of side drops wintergreen. Sensitive species on the edge of the range is what that's supposed to imply. Cusick sweet pea, this is way out of range. I think that's what it is. The only population this far at its edge of the Pontilla gracilis variety Flabelliformis. I've been calling it Idaho cinquefoil because you can find the Ceanothus sanguineus at the edge, south edge of this range. It was a range extension, and a little isolated population of Mertens rush on Schaefer Butte. This is a high elevation thing that is definitely taking a jump to get to Schaefer Butte. I don't know if these qualify as sensitive, but they're just cool flowers to go look for. Right after the snow melts in early spring, I try to get these in the wildflower show. The yellow fawn lily, mountain kittentails, native peony, and I love little steer's head. But you have to get up there early to find them. Lots of species known only from historical records, but that might be partially for lack of haven't been to the right spot at the right time. But I'm afraid that Spiranthes, which I collected once near the base area, may have been already wiped out by the recent construction increase in recreational infrastructure. Ladies' dress orchids. What's on the backside of the Boise Ridge? Was one of my outings this last thing of trying to figure out where to draw the backside boundary. And there's this road that comes from Roby Creek. So here's, here's the, oops, here's the Summit Trail road here. And there's Highway 21, and there's this road that cuts across kind of right at the south or at the edge of the forest, the national forest. So I figured that made sense as a boundary. It's largely unexplored. Very few herbarium specimens. Oddly enough, the main herbarium specimens, if there's some specimens that from 1911 and 1940 by June Clark or Bernice Bjornson that say Clear Creek, Boise, and they're sometimes put as Ada County. But I think they may actually be instead, there may have been there's a Clear Creek Summit. This might have been one of the stage stations or post office for, I'm even wondering, was this the original stagecoach route to get between Boise and Idaho City rather than along Moores Creek after it came over Rocky Canyon? So there's still some historical stuff. The new ski run being proposed is going to be in this area. I have no idea what sensitive plants may or may not be in the way. One of the surprises I did find is the ponderosa pine were just loaded with the western dwarf mistletoe. This is a different species than the one that's in the Douglas fir that has been accused of being a problem. And I haven't seen it in any of the ponderosa pines on the west side of the ridge, but it was just abundant along the road. So that was rather a surprise. Primary invasives of the conifer zone include spotted knapweed, and as I mentioned before, the patience dock is really a problem and spreading. And unfortunately, all of the anything that disturbs the soil is going to favor these to spread that much more. So some of the questions and challenges: unknown impacts on the full plant diversity by expanded recreation, the forest thinning operations, climate change. There's lots of exploration potential. Some of the sensitive species might actually be more common, or they might be threatened by the impacts. We don't know what additional species. I'd like to see that, as I'll mention later, wildflowers, let's make wildflowers one of the things that the expanded recreation capitalizes on rather than ignoring. That segues into the concept that native plant diversity in general in the Boise Front is increasingly under siege. I mean, we got the escalating housing development, overuse and abuse by non-compliant recreation, competition from invasive non-natives that are favored by fire, the increasingly common fires. And going back to this, even though native forbs are the primary component of vascular plant diversity in the Boise Front, they receive limited attention and management plans. There's a few handful of the really rare species that get looked at, but we could be losing, what's essentially almost a quarter of the diversity, nearly half the, and not even pay attention, not even realize if we're not paying attention. The native forbs are not only dependent on, but they're a good indicator for good quality shrub steppe. This is their habitat. They need these open space that isn't filled with thatch. But unfortunately, the shrub steppe is highly vulnerable to disturbance, which favors invasive non-natives. It's easy to get this converted into that. So the original shrub steppe, lots of wildflowers, good wildlife habitat. And at least this kind is fairly resilient to fires because there's nothing to carry it. Once the non-natives take over, there's few wildflowers, it's poor wildlife habitat, and very fire prone. It's easy to get from this to this. All you have to do is bulldoze or have a few fires in a row. Very hard, if even possible, to ever get, even moderately back to it. Just another idea that I've been realizing, listening to some other things I want to throw out too, is the idea that the native forbs might even be having this double bind death spiral problem. That if the invading non-natives reduce natives by competing for critical resource, replacing essential bare ground with thatch, contributing to more frequent fires. And if on top of this, the non-specialist herbivores, and this can be both natives and non-natives, as well as seed predators, if they have their populations, the herbivore populations are maintained by the invasives, but they prefer the native forbs over the invasives, they're going to increasingly target whatever remaining forbs are left and make them rarer and rarer if the herbivore population is not limited by the availability of the native forbs, because they can eat the non-natives, but they target preferentially the native forbs. And you can see that there could be a point of no return, that it's almost impossible to get the native forbs going back without removing all predators, including the native predators. I don't know. I mean, it's just one of these thoughts to think about. Okay, so I've got a few proposals to help. One is that we could include the regionally sensitive species, a more, still a lot, but maybe a more handleable number of things as a metric of an indication of ecosystem health. Partially because native plants are important in their own right, not just, well, they support this animal, they support pollinators. No, they support themselves. They are themselves meat species. And as pointed out, they can easily disappear. We can lose, if we lost the sensitives, we lose 1/4 of our native flora without even realizing, if we're not paying attention. And they are then also prime indicators of intact versus degraded habitats. Proposal 2 is, the more we can avoid disturbing, developing the remaining good quality shrub, steppe, and other special habitats, that's where we get the biggest bang for a buck, by not destroying them in the first place. These habitats are already increasingly rare and disappearing. Once lost, reversal is extremely problematic and expensive, if not outright impossible. And at present, at best, restoration only involves a small fraction of the original diversity. We're not going to be replanting with 50 different species of herbs. It's just not available. Another proposal is that prioritize removal of invasives and otherwise intact habitats. I like the firefighting analogy. Rather than jumping into the middle of the conflagration, the infestation, you first focus on hotspots and containment. That's where you're going to get the biggest bang for your buck. Especially if you combine this with the early detection of novel invasives, trying to second guess which are the ones that if we can get rid of them now, it'll save us a lot of problem down the line. I really encourage the Bradley method as described, where you kind of work with the local diversity to try to tip the balance in favor of what's already there, rather than focusing on, well, we'll just replant with other stuff. And for more on the Bradley method, here's a reference to one nice article about it. You can just Google and find Bradley method weed control. Started in Australia, and it's what we used in California. And it takes a longer time to work, it's a long haul thing, but I think it's the way that really pays off. And it also takes advantage that people can be the problem, but they can also be the solution. That you've got people who can, adopt and take stewardship care. Proposal 4, discourage planting of potential invasives at the wildland urban interface. Here we see the hardy pampas grass spreading from cultivation, myrtle spurge spreading down from cultivation. And there's a whole list, these are just some that I came up with while putting this, of what are some of the other incipient escapees that could turn into problems. Penicidum alopecuroides, I finally found some starting to spread into the urban interface, that wildland interface. Some additional proposals to protect and promote native wildflower diversity. I really would think we should get more, I like the idea of trying to get more short interpretive trails that showcase the diversity of our native flora. There should be more wildflower trails, not just, it's just another user group to try to help. And, but we need to have a representative at the table where these decisions are made in order for it to happen. I'd also like to see an expanded diversity of native forbs and especially local genotypes in restoration projects, and also avoid impacting the remaining intact habitats when you're planting. I've been finding some places where, oh, that was not a good place. That was a nice little open space in its own right. Some prime restoration candidates for the green belt that come to mind would be the hemp dogbane, which is also important indigenous plant, very important fiber plant. So that one would be good. Several different asters, all of which would be fine. Rough goldenrod, wonderful fall bee plants. And I'm wondering if, these might not be available in cultivation because they spread too much in gardens, but you want them to spread and be rhizomatous. So that's the thing. And just kind of end up a little bit the philosophy. Why does caring for what grows where you live matter? I mean, who cares what's growing around Boise? It's more important to be concerned about the rainforest or someplace. And well, remember that the global diversity is the sum total of local biodiversity, and that includes the variation within even widespread species. All areas, including Boise, harbor unique assemblages of species, and there are going to be locally unique genotypes at the very least. Well, I think there's more than those. But those unique genotypes is part of the local, global biodiversity. And even if you do want to spend most of your time advocating for conservation in some other part of the world, realize that your credibility to do so is going to be undermined if they can turn to you and say, well, you're not taking care of your own backyard. Why should we? And also finally, if not you, then who is going to be the people who care about the Boise area? When I read Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass, it really resonated in this. I strongly recommend it. It makes, the idea of each of us comes from people who were once indigenous. We can reclaim our membership in the cultures of gratitude that formed our own relationships with the living earth. And this practice celebrates cultures of regenerative reciprocity, where wealth is understood to be having enough to share and riches are counted in mutually beneficial relationships. Besides, it makes us happy. So idea of regenerative reciprocity, get that down right, resonated because so much of when I'm out in the foothills, I feel gratitude for what the foothills, even before reading this, gratitude for what the foothills are giving me in terms of replenishment, nourishment, beauty. And I figure it's my obligation. How can I pay back? Often I'll do the pick three, I'll find at least some weed to pull, just a little bit, just, that's my paying back for this thing. Doing this project is part of my paying back. Which seems for those of you who might also want to, a few volunteer opportunities. I could use help locating new populations of sensitive and historical species, among other things, lots of exploration, help with the annual Wildflower Plus show. I'd love to teach a group, maybe master naturalists, how to take over leading the wildflower walks that I've already developed. You just need training, though I keep hoping to do more. I think that would be more. Join the weed warrior, learn how to do target and work on getting rid of the invasives, help propagate a greater diversity of native to site wildflowers for local restorations, and advocate for more interpretive trails. And if you want to be involved with any of these, you can send an email to the Pahovi email here, and it can be forwarded to whoever's in charge of these different programs. And just end with the guiding principle with me and my little grandniece there, that our future in this planet is dependent on whether we can transform a relationship from exploitation to stewardship. Business as usual is not an option. Thank you all. Ta-da, over.
Thank you so much, Barbara. I couldn't help thinking as you were giving the talk that you often say the treasures of the Boise Front, but then I was thinking, well, you're this amazing treasure